Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and you're joining us in another special edition of Let Us Reason. And of course, with us, a mighty warrior for the Lord, our dear brother Anthony Rogers, whom I'm always blessed to have on my show, and also blessed just to learn from the wisdom that God has given him. If you guys don't know anything about Anthony Rogers, you're living under a rock, and I pray for you. So you need to actually go and Google him. He has a YouTube channel, and I'll ask him to share more about that. But also recently, you probably have seen the video series that he and I did concerning really the Trinity in Old Testament, which is a very powerful teaching, especially when people assume sometimes that you cannot prove the Trinity in a strong way outside of the New Testament. But my brother here did an amazing job. As always, I want to welcome all of you who are joining us, and I welcome also our moderators, and thank you for the great job that you do. I see a number of you already. And as always, let's keep it professional, folks. Let's keep it focused on the topic. Today's topic has to do with Allah using basically plurality of himself. And believe it or not, folks, I was, heavily involved with the Answering Islam by way of editing some of their articles. And that was the first time I came across Anthony Rogers' name. And it was funny because I was given a 3, I think, or 5-part article about Allah's use of the we, the plurality in the Quran. And I'm like, bless his heart, man. I mean, he didn't leave a single room open for any argument after that. So, brother, welcome back, and thank you so much for the work that you do. Give people a quick background about you, your ministry, your YouTube channel, and any recent development, by the way.
Yeah, okay. So first, just want to praise the Lord for you, for this opportunity. It's always great to be with you and have an opportunity to edify others. My name, as you already said, is Anthony Rogers. We've known each other for many years. I don't even remember how far it goes back, but our first interactions were on Answering Islam. Both of us were contributors to the website. And as you know, but the listeners may not, sometimes the native English speakers will want to address a topic on Islam that may require some insight from those who have the blessing of also knowing Arabic. And I was dealing with an issue early on that you just mentioned regarding Allah's use of plural pronouns. It struck me as curious, especially given what I knew to be the meaning in the Old Testament. That fascinated me. I pursued that with great zeal. I read all sorts of literature on it, and it was considered wise to pass that on to people like yourself, Bassam Madani, and there was another person as well. I know Jochin Cates and Sam Shamoon were both involved in looking at it, but mostly just from critiquing it perspective, making sure all the bases were covered. But so I have been an author on Answering Islam for many years. I've also been a contributor on David's channel for many years. David and I go way back as well. We used to write on the Answering Muslims blog together back when Nabil was still alive. We still can write on the blog. We just don't make use of it. We find it so much more useful to use YouTube. So that gives you something of an idea about me. I also have my own YouTube page, and I've really only in the past couple of months been doing anything on a regular basis on that channel. So I'm trying to build that channel up. Like I said, for years, I've been doing stuff on David's channel, but I'd like to also build that channel up. I also am a pastor. I specifically serve in prisons. I go into the prisons and minister to prisoners in South Carolina. And I also do 100 other things. So, I have a wife and 4 children.
Amen, brother. Amen. And really the prison ministry is crucial, brother, because I'm sure you meet with a lot of people who have converted to Islam. You meet with Jehovah's Witness. You probably meet also with Mormons. You meet with Unitarians. So there is a mixture of things that you end up dealing with. And even outside of that ministry, as you mentioned to me, that you enjoy engaging people theologically in general. And that's what I like, by the way, folks, about Anthony. He's not just specifically one niche, just saying evangelism to Islam and apologetic to Islam. No, he is biblicist. He talks about the issues theologically from the Bible, and all of us as followers of Christ need to be enriched by that. I want to thank Islam Critique for being here with us. Thank you so much, brother. Thank you also for your super chat. By the way, folks, Islam Critique has an amazing show yesterday, and I know he didn't ask me to promote this. When I saw him, it prompted me to remember. He brought a professor in Harvard. His name is Dr. Shadi Hikmat Nasser, which I've been following because of my PhD. And he talked about the topic of qira'at, and Dr. Nasser is one of the world experts in the field. So I encourage you guys to go and watch the show. It was amazing. So thank you, brother, for doing so. And back again to you, brother. So tell me, I mean, obviously, as a Muslim, a former Muslim, the idea of inna, for instance, when Allah speaks that way, it didn't bother me. I wasn't thinking much about it. I mean, it's like almost like the plural of majesty, if you wish, even though we're not taught about it this way. But let's talk more about that. I mean, from your perspective and your finding and the damage that this can cause.
Yeah, well, obviously, Islam's central article is Tawheed, the idea that Allah is absolutely one. And when Muslims advance this notion, they usually speak of it as if it precludes any notion of plurality in Allah. Now, really, that has to be the meaning, that it excludes any kind of plurality. I don't mean just a plurality of persons, but any kind of plurality in Allah's being. Because according to the Qur'an, when it rejects the Trinity, it pits this against the notion of Allah's unity. That means that unless the Qur'an is wrong about the Trinity, then that has to be the notion that it's objecting to when it asserts Allah's unity. And so when you consider that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is not a belief in that God has, that the persons of the Trinity are simply parts of God. Rather, the persons of the Trinity each share the entirety of the divine essence, right? That's the mystery that's involved in the Trinity. That it's not like human beings where one human being is a particular instance of human nature, right? And then another human being is another instantiation of human nature. Rather, we say all three persons partake of or possess entirely the divine nature. And so what Muslims are objecting to is not the notion that there is a plurality of gods, although they do object to that, and they often confuse the Trinity for that. But for the Quran not to be an error, it has to be objecting also to the notion that there is plurality within God, right? Not just that there's a one being next to another being next to another being. And this was brought out to me through reading all sorts of Islamic sources. In fact, the Shiite sources and the Mu'tazili sources are especially strong here because they actually say that. They'll say that Allah doesn't even have a plurality of attributes. And they chide their Sunni counterparts or antagonists, however you want to view them. They charge them with being guilty of shirk because they believe Allah has a plurality of attributes. And so just those sorts of things started getting me thinking about this. And there were some other things tied into it as well. But I just realized there's something at least initially curious about Allah speaking in the plural. And maybe I could just throw this out there just to sort of get people's wheels turning here. But even if you accept the idea that it's a plural of majesty, which I'm going to show is not true, but even if you accept that, why would Muslims who think that Allah is absolutely one associate plurality with majesty, right? Why think that way if you're a Muslim? If Allah is absolutely one and there's no one more majestic than Allah, then you would think that the appropriate way to express that would be simply in terms that communicate unicity or his exclusivity, his being sole or alone. But no, they say the opposite. They say that plurality bespeaks majesty. Now, I quite agree with that. I do believe the notion of plurality bespeaks fullness, richness, majesty. But then I'm a Trinitarian, and that sort of thinking makes sense to me. But I don't see how it makes sense on an Islamic, foundation. So it was a real curiosity to me. And if I could just also throw in here, this isn't just me. I run across Muslims over the years who find trouble with this notion, and they need their scholars to try and quell this brewing problem in their mind. But here is something I read a long time ago. This is on a website called Muslim Matters, and I could give the link to people if they want. But This is just one quote from this particular article. It says, translating the Arabic nahnu to we, when Allah is referring to himself, is therefore highly problematic, not simply because the awkward use of English alienates and confuses the listener, but more importantly, because it obscures the core message of Islam, Tawheed. Okay, so that is a Muslim saying that. And
Exactly.
then when you look at the comment section of that article, you have other Muslims saying, yeah, this is problematic to me too. I always wonder about this.
And here's another thing I want to throw another wrench into this argument. Nahnu is always, at least I know a Muslim will hold me to this, but in general, I want to argue that it's always associated with the inna, and the emphatic plurality. It's not just nahnu, which translated we, inna nahnu, meaning emphatically it is we. And that's kind of like doesn't leave a wiggle room, right, for any argument that it is intended. What about the argument? I'm going to put it right here. One of our friends, Andrew Martin, says that sometimes a Muslim says this is an editorial we. Have you heard something like that before?
Well, I mean, so first of all, you'd have to find proof that this sort of thing existed in Arabic at the time of Muhammad. And that's part of my argument. So this isn't the only attempt to explain this. It's the most popular, the royal we, I mean. The royal we is by far and away the most popular. But there are all sorts of attempts to explain this. One of my basic problems with any of these explanations, so this covers all of them, is that you do not find Muhammad explaining these things in this way in the Qur'an. Okay? The Qur'an is supposed to be exhaustively detailed. It's supposed to explain its verses and its meanings. And where the Quran itself doesn't, Muslims expect the Hadith to do so. But we don't find anything like that. And so you either have to say it was introduced in the Quran, but you don't find that, or you have to say it can be discerned from Quranic usage. And I'll argue you can't find that either. You can't show that this is the way it's consistently used. But then thirdly, if you can't find it in the Quran, either as an explanation or just by observing how it's used, then you have to show it was a feature of Arabic grammar at the time of Muhammad, right? And you just can't do that. There isn't examples of the royal we, the editorial we. I mean, it's not a newspaper, right? For one, I mean, I'm not trying to, cheapen the argument, but what basis is there for believing that there's an editorial we in Arabic prior to the Quran or contemporaneous with the time the Quran was written? So that would just be an initial observation. But I have I'm holding back here just a little bit because there's really a lot more devastating argumentation, but I want to save it for some of what we'll talk about as we go along, especially when we discuss the royal we. But after knocking down several of these, what I'm going to show you to the chagrin of Muslims is that Muhammad was actually asked to deal with this question. And how he did so is quite embarrassing.
Very good. Why don't you walk us through the argument, brother, and I'll interject thoughts, and also we'll check for questions periodically.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit of, right now about where I finally end up. This isn't my entire account of where I arrive at. But I do believe that ultimately the explanation is that for why Muhammad employs this way of speaking in the Quran for Allah is that he picked it up from Jews and Christians like a dog picks up fleas. A dog doesn't know where it gets these fleas, right? It doesn't know where they come from. It's just strolling along and the fleas jump on it. Well, Muhammad overheard Jews and Christians. Again, I'm just throwing this out there so you have an idea. But he's overhearing Jews and Christians recite their scriptures, and he hears God speaking in the plural, right? Passages like Genesis 1:26, where God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness." And by the way, those are true plurals. They do refer to a plurality of persons. It's not a plural of majesty or an editorial we. And if you want proof of that, I have many articles on the subject, but I think recently did a whole, I did a whole series on this recently. If you go to my YouTube page, it's called The Old Testament Witness to the Trinity. So the first couple of episodes, I kind of try and deal with that. But in any case, Muhammad overheard this kind of speaking in when he heard the Jews and Christians reciting. Let me just recite or give you a hadith here as an example. This is from Sahih al-Bukhari, 6944, or it's in other editions, book 89, hadith number 5. This is just to establish that Muhammad overheard Jews and Christians reciting things. It says, narrated Abu Huraira, while we were in the mosque, Allah's messenger came out to us and said, let us proceed to the Jews. So we went along with him till we reached Bayat al-Midras, a place where the Torah used to be recited and all the Jews of the town used to gather. Okay, so not only were the pagans reciting their poetry, not only was Muhammad reciting his putative revelations, but the Jews were reciting the Torah. And then elsewhere in the Hadith literature, you hear that the Christians did the same sort of thing. This was a common thing, especially in an oral culture. It wasn't distinctive to Islam. So my claim, at least initially here, is that Muhammad overheard this sort of thing. He started to use it when giving his revelations, assuming it just to be the way God speaks. And later, when he's challenged on it, he's flummoxed. He doesn't know how to deal with this. And so that's, I don't want to talk about that just yet. But so the thing that Muslims say today, I mean, one thing that they'll say is that the plurality, this is not the most popular, but some will say that Allah, it includes Allah, the angels, and Muhammad. Now you can kind of understand why they might think that. After all, the Qur'an is allegedly being revealed from Allah through Jibreel to Muhammad. So when it's being recited, in some sense, you can say it involves all three, right? Muhammad is sort of the mouthpiece for the other two. Now, I think most Muslims are a little uncomfortable with that because they want to make it very clear that the Quran is exclusively Allah's speech and not in any way the speech of Jibreel or Muhammad. In fact, anybody who says it's the speech of a man is threatened with hellfire in the Quran. But
that's right.
That at least is suggested in, here's, for example, a quote from Ibn Taymiyyah, who's known as the Sheikh of Islam, at least to Salafi Muslims. But he says the view of the Salaf, that's the early generations of Muslims, the view of the Salaf of this Ummah and of its Imams and later generations is that the Prophet heard the Quran from Jibreel and Jibreel heard it from Allah. The use of plural forms in such phrases is the style of Arabic speech used to refer to one who is of high standing and has helpers who obey him. So here you get the impression from Ibn Taymiyyah that he's saying Allah employs this plurality language because he's including Jibreel and Muhammad as his helpers in this language. Now, the problem with that is, among other things, while you might be able to find statements of the Quran that use plural speech that could seemingly comport with that, agree with that, there are many uses of we and us and our and so forth that don't admit of that kind of understanding, if for no other reason than that Allah speaks as we to the angels and as we to Muhammad, right? Just to give a couple of examples here. This is Allah speaking to the angels. It says in Surah 234, behold, we said to the angels, bow down to Adam.
That's right. That's right. And also another example, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun, chapter 15, verse 9, we revealed the remembrance and we will protect it. So are you telling me Muhammad and the angels are part of that? Then they all failed actually in doing so. Right, right. And we could easily multiply, as you know, in my article on this, it was five articles long, right? I don't remember how many pages each article is. I think it's at least about 50 pages, roughly 10 per part. But what I did, because the Quran does this so often, is I basically just focused on the first 7 chapters of the Quran and found hundreds of references, right? And so in those hundreds of references, I give all the examples that I think conflict with one or another interpretation. And so here, I just gave one example.
You gave another example, but we could easily multiply the examples, right? So this is just an example of the fact that Allah uses we when addressing the angels. I could also give examples where Allah uses we to refer to Muhammad, right? Where he says, you know, we sent down this Quran to you, or something along those lines. But this by itself is sufficient to prove that the explanation that we includes Allah, the angels, and Muhammad doesn't it cover the range of this phenomena in the Quran. And so it's not a sufficient explanation. Okay. And I would also point out that it also fails because in some passages it says things like we created or we decreed. Obviously, that can't include the angels or Muhammad. Now, some Muslims may try to smuggle the angels or Muhammad into that, but then I would be quick to follow that up by saying, well, that's shirk, right? According to Muslims, you know, we're the ones guilty of shirk for including Christ and the Spirit in the Trinity, but we're not saying that creatures are God or that creatures are responsible for creation. We're not saying there are other beings besides God. We're saying they are the one God. And so if us saying that Christ is God created is shirk, then surely Muslims saying angels as creators or decreers constitutes shirk. So that explanation is quite obviously fallacious. It doesn't explain or account for what we find in the Quran. Right. So,
exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't know if you wanted to interject at that point.
No, I'm in agreement with you. And some are asking, of course, like when was the concept of Tawheed mentioned in Islam? I would argue that it was at least reported to us through Hadith and then Tafsir. But when exactly, because the word is not found in the Quran, but the concept itself is found in the Quran. Muslims will quote you chapter 112, of course, all the time, saying that Qul huwa Allahu ahad, even though the use of ahad, by the way, is, in my view, a strong argument for what you just mentioned, being influenced by Jewish theology, because it's echad, you know, and that's where you find it in the Shema as an example, you know, so.
Yeah, you know, that's actually a very interesting verse for quite a number of reasons. That whole chapter, the all 4 verses, it's one of the shorter chapters of the Quran, and the reason is because according to at least some reports, Muhammad said this. He came up with Surah 112 as a response to Jews who were asking him about his Lord, right? So it's not surprising that at that point he suddenly uses the word echad. However, and I don't want to, you know, go off on a rabbit trail. Anybody who's listened to me on my live streams knows they know I like rabbit trails. But I think Muhammad quickly found out that this word is problematic for him because he drops the word. Can you think of another case where Muhammad uses ahad in the Quran to describe Allah's unity?
There isn't. I mean, it's used, by the way, to describe ahad as one of for other instances, but not describing God, which is the argument we raise. If you want to use it from a pure Arabic, it does not say one. One is wahid. You know, why would you use something strange like this for it?
Right. And a second curiosity to me about that, not just a curiosity, this is another issue that I've pursued. But when the Jews asked Muhammad, describe your Lord to us, they also said, of what is he made? Of what does he consist? One thing we know about Jews of the Hijaz during that period, or in Arabia, was that they were thoroughgoing anthropomorphists. In fact, if you look at if you look at the Ash'ari Muslims, you'll often hear them rejecting certain hadiths and referring to them as Israeli hadith. How do you put that?
Israeliyat, yes, you know, attributed to Israeli or Jewish sources.
Right. So they reject those hadiths as unreliable because they come from Jews. And they're not just talking about unbelieving Jews. They're talking about Jews who came to profess Islam, right? And so they're excluding all those sorts of things. And so they reject a lot of the anthropomorphic hadiths, especially.
If you can explain to our viewers what you mean by that. I know, of course, the term, but just in case someone wants to know what that meant.
Yeah, so when Christians sometimes will use the phrase anthropomorphic, but we're using it differently than Muslims. if we read in the Old Testament a statement like where it says that God covers us under his wings, or better yet, in Exodus 15, it says that Pharaoh and his armies were congealed in the sea at the blast of God's nostrils, right? When God caused the sea to come over them. We would say that's an anthropomorphic expression, meaning that it's a figure of speech. It just means that God caused them to be drowned. He exerted his power, and they were deluged in the waters.
And God is using a language to make it easier for me to understand, basically.
Right. However, when Muslims use the word anthropomorphic, what they mean by it is a little bit more literal. They're saying that somebody is guilty of ascribing human attributes to Allah in a literal sense. He actually has attributes, anatomical features, face, eyes, hands, shin. I mentioned shin in the singular because some Muslims are so strict with this that since it only mentions one shin, they don't say that he has two. But the Qur'an says he has two hands, so they'll say he has two hands. In fact, the hadith say he has two right hands. So some Muslims will say that.
Yeah. And by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah took this very literal, actually.
Right.
And he argued against the Asharis for this reason.
Right. So when I approached the Quran early on as a Christian, I assumed that the Quran just uses figurative language like the Bible does. We even use figurative language about ourselves, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything literal, right? Like if you say to me, can I give you a hand and talk to this person, right? Give me a hand. All you're saying is help me out. You don't literally mean that you want me to use my hand for something, right? You're just saying to help you, right? So I assumed when I was reading the Quran, that's how it uses language like this as well. But I just kept stumbling over things in the Quran thinking, no, this seems to me like it means it quite literally, right? And one of the classic examples here is the statement that the angels were to bow down to Adam. Okay. Sometimes Muslims will say that Allah's hands just refer to his power. Allah created the heavens by his hands. The problem is that everything was created by Allah's hands in that sense, right? If it's just a figure of speech for his power. But when Allah upbraids Satan for not bowing down to Adam, he says, how could you refuse to bow down to one that I created with my own two hands? That's Surah 38:75. So here, this is given as the stated reason why Satan should have prostrated to Adam. But if that's what made Adam special and an appropriate object of prostration, then it would likewise follow that we should prostrate to everything. The angel should prostrate to everything. But this is being given as the special reason for bowing to Adam. Well, then when you look at the hadith sources, it actually tells us that Allah only created 3 or 4. There's a difference in the sources. 3 or 4 things directly with his own hands. It says he planted the trees of the Garden of Eden with his own hands. He created Adam with his own hands. He wrote the Torah with his own hands. And then some also add the pen. He created the pen with his own hands. Kind of a strange 4th thing to include as the special, object of Allah's favor there. But and then you got hadith where the famous hadith of intercession. It's a mutawatir hadith. It's mass narrated, where people on the day of judgment are going to be so fearful. They're waiting this long period. Some sources say it's going to last 50,000 days. And people are going to want to rush the judgment, and they're going to go to people fearful and say, intercede with Allah for us so he's not angry. And the first person they're going to think to seek out is Adam. And the reason he's going to stand out to them is because he was created with Allah's own hands. And so they think he's going to have some favor with Allah. And then Adam says, no, I sinned. Go ask, Noah, right? And then each messenger, of course, turns them away until we get to Muhammad, who, of course, fits the bill. But what you see in the case of all of them is something in particular is singled out as what makes them special. Adam is special because Allah created him with his own hands. Moses is special because Allah wrote the Torah for him with his own hands. Abraham is special because he was the friend of Allah. Jesus is special because he was the word and spirit from Allah. So it's very clear that Adam is being singled out in a special sense as the object of what Allah created with his hands. So I don't want to keep going with that. We'll lose completely the us thing. But the reason I brought this up is because the Jews were anthropomorphists. They believed this sort of thing in the 7th century. And that's clear from all sorts of sources. And these are the Jews Muhammad's interacting with. These are the Jews who are asking him in Surah 112, what is your Lord made of, right? Not only who is your Lord, but what is he made of? Well, you probably know, if you look at Surah 112, that one of the things Allah says there is samad, right? He doesn't just say that he is ahad, he says samad.
Yeah.
How do Muslim translators translate this? They're all over the map.
Exactly.
They're all over the map. If you look at the translations, some will say eternal. They've got like 20 different interpretations of this. If you look in not Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, you look at Al-Tabari, he gives 40 different narrations about this. And the one he says that is authentic, that goes back to Muhammad, says it means solid. And there are other sources that verify this as well. It says solid. Your Lord is solid. Remember, he's supposedly answering the Jews who said, what is he made of? And Allah says he's solid in the Qur'an. So I find that particular passage that Muslims think is just this bastion of proving pure tawheed, pure monotheism. Number one, it doesn't prove it because it chooses the wrong word, ahad, meaning one of. And then two, it uses a word that implies anthropomorphism, which is clearly patently contrary to the absolute deity that we see presented in Scripture and believed in by at least historic Orthodox Jews and Christians.
Absolutely. Yeah, Renee, thank you so much for your super chat. Renee has a question in light of what we have covered so far. If Allah says we, isn't that an act of shirk, basically? Even if it includes Muhammad and the angels, let's say, use that argument.
Yeah, well, certainly if it includes Muhammad and the angels, because some of those passages say things like we create, we decreed, we sent down, and it's not even the statement we sent down is not inconsistent with the notion that it includes Muhammad, because there are even passages of the Quran that seem to suggest that Muhammad was sent down. I think it's in Surah 5 where it talks about the Qur'an and a light or whatever that were sent down with him, referring to Muhammad, but it uses the phrase with him, right? How is the Qur'an or whatever sent down with Muhammad unless Muhammad himself has been sent down? And some Muslims have taken it that way. Qurtubi took it that way. Other Muslims took it that way. But anyways, it is shirk. It's shirk because it would entail that they are in some sense involved with Allah in things like creating, in things like decreeing, and in other acts that Muslims accuse others of being polytheists for implicating others in, right? Remember, Muhammad was the one who said that the pagans of his time were guilty of shirk because they said other people could be intercessors with Allah. They didn't claim their deities were higher than Allah or equal to Allah, right? So it doesn't work to say, well, the angels are lower than Allah, they're serving Allah. Muhammad was objecting to the very idea that the angels or some other intermediary beings were involved even in an intercessory way in these activities. And so if we turn around, or if Allah turns around in the Quran and includes them in these activities, well, then it's shirk, just as much as they think it is when they turn those arguments against other, polytheists.
So I'm going to piggyback on what you just mentioned, and I'm going to read one verse right now, and I want people to hear how many persons are speaking either directly or indirectly or spoken of in that verse. So, for instance, if anyone were to go and read a translation, even though in Arabic it's true, translation of Surah 17, verse 1, which really talks about this ascension, technically speaking, the ascension that Muhammad took all the way to heaven through the Aqsa Mosque, which is the far mosque, which that's a whole different debate, by the way, whether the mosque was in existence at that time or not. It says glory. Now, if Allah is speaking, look how Allah is speaking right now in this verse. Again, chapter 17, verse 1. Glory be to him who made his servant to go on a night from the sacred mosque to the remote mosque. Notice Allah is speaking about himself right now. And then it says, of which we have blessed the precincts so that we may show to him some of our signs. Surely he is hearing and seeing. Look how many ways Allah spoke about himself, basically, if he is Allah that's speaking. Otherwise, we have at least three persons involved in this whole conversation.
Actually, so think about this. When Allah uses the plural, it's plural, right? It's not dual. There's a dual in Arabic, right? So this has to mean at least three or more, right? When he speaks in the plural. That's correct?
That's correct. I'm muting myself. Yes.
Yeah. So my point here is, so you have Allah speaking in the plural, but he also speaks about Allah in the third person.
That's right. That's like we've seen here.
Yeah. So now you have at least four persons. Allah's, and even if you try and take the plural as somehow a singular referent, he's still talking about Allah. So you still have a two persons. Now, some people might try and say this is just Iliism, and if it was, to me, the problem with that sort of thing, Iliism means when one person talks about himself. You can do that. There are certain contexts where it makes sense to do that. But Allah does this far too often. And this is not just my observation, by the way. Neil Robinson, in his book, what's it called? I have it here somewhere. Anyways, Neil Robinson, in one of his books, points out just the sheer volume of times that Allah does this, where he banters back and forth between using the singular, the plural, first person, third person. He says it's dizzying and hard to keep track of. And he's saying this as somebody at least favorable to Islam, if not actually a Muslim. I've heard conflicting accounts of whether he's Muslim or not. Anyways, but there's a lot of confusion there. If nothing else, Allah, by talking this way, sure hasn't, done what he claims to do in giving a perfectly eloquent Quran, right? It's certainly not a model of eloquence. It's quite dizzying and confusing, whether you can account for its meaning or not. It's not very intelligible. But so let's move on to the plural of majesty before we run out of time. I don't know how long you want to do this, but
brother, even if we're not done today, I like the multi-series, of course. Because we want to give this topic its due diligence. So let's call this part one.
Okay.
And we'll come back again and do more. Prof, to you, Smith, thank you so much for your super chat. Go ahead, brother. So what is the next element of this argument that you would like to address?
Okay, well, let's address the popular one. Let's go to the plural of majesty. Now, this is the most popular one. And, many years ago, I was reading, actually, it's kind of funny now that I think about it. The phenomena that we were just talking about, where Allah switches from speaking in the first person to speaking in the third person, that's referred to as iltifat, right? It's considered by Muslims now a piece of beautiful rhetoric, right, employed masterfully in the Qur'an. We look at it and say it's gibberish. Muslims are obligated to say, oh, it's so beautiful how Allah, can't consistently speak in the first person or third person, even in the same sentence, right? Mm-hmm. But I was reading an article on iltifat by an Islamic scholar named M.A.S. Abdel Halim. And M.A.S. Abdel Halim made this statement that I want to read for you. Here's what he says. He says, it should be pointed out that in pre-Islamic literature and during the time of the revelation of the Qur'an, pronouns do not appear to have been used as indicative of status. Okay? They did not change with social status, and the plural of majesty in particular does not appear to have been used by or for addressing or referring to kings or chiefs. The prophet and his early successors did not use it for themselves, nor in their letters to address kings or governors. Okay?
So, that would have been a perfect example, right? If that was in use.
Yeah. Yeah, he wrote to the king of Abyssinia, other occasions. Supposedly, he wrote to all the kings right before his death and told them all to submit to Islam. But we don't find that, according to MAS Abdel Halim, we don't find that as a feature of Arabic prior to the time of Muhammad or at the time of Muhammad. But he does add this last line, and this is what I'm going to pick up on and show you the problem with. He does say, it was clearly in the Qur'an that such usage was introduced, as has been shown on the basis of a highly sophisticated application of the concept of plurality. Okay, so he claims this is something that was introduced with the Qur'an. Allah alone came up with this. What else would you expect a Muslim to think, right? This is entirely heaven sent. Allah uniquely speaks this way. Now, it's kind of humorous because even if we say the plural of majesty didn't exist in Arabic, I think most people would say it did exist in other cultures. You know, somebody else can do the work, the footwork on that to see if that's true. But you know, it's not surprising that a Muslim would like to claim that Allah is the one who came up with this, right? De novo. But now here's the issue that this raises. Did you want to interject?
I was just going to say, this is yet another example and proof that Muhammad was influenced by the Jews. That's the only explanation for it.
Right, right. So here's what I started thinking after reading that article by MAS Abdel Halim. I started thinking, okay, if it wasn't, because a lot of times Muslims will say it's just Arabic, right? Like, I understand that contemporary Muslims are now comfortable with this, right? It makes sense for them to just understand this as a plural of majesty. But the issue is, now that you realize it wasn't part of Arabic grammar at the time, it wasn't how they spoke, then the question becomes, how did anybody that first heard the Quran understand this unless it was explained to them, or unless the Quran in some way indicates the meaning of this plural language, right? Because otherwise it's just inexplicable. It's an enigma. And how can that be in Allah's perspicuous book, right? It's supposed to be perfectly clear. And in fact, you're going to find out that this is what this will be in another broadcast, but remember that Muhammad claims the Quran is clear. He supposedly preached for 23 years, right? From the time of his prophetic calling in 510 to, 23 years later, 22, 23. I know there's a little bit of, question there, but for 22 of those years, Muhammad was saying the Quran was clear. As soon as the good old Christians of Najran came and challenged Muhammad on using plural pronouns for Allah, suddenly Muhammad started singing a different tune. But everybody who wants to know about that's going to have to come back to the next episode, because we're not there yet. But
you guys heard it. There's a second episode. I hope everybody recorded that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So here, though, I realized, if that wasn't part of Arabic grammar at the time or usage, then how does anybody know this is a plural of majesty, right? Unless Muhammad explains it or Allah explains it, or I would grant that you could also show this is how it's consistently used in the Quran. So let me read for you some statements from Muslims that are going to help us to see if this is the case. This is a statement from Sheikh Karamali. You might be familiar with him, I don't know. But Sheikh Karamali says, when he, Allah, uses nahnu, we, to refer to himself, nahnu is the royal we and connotes majesty. Someone steeped in the Quranic language will feel humbled before the divine majesty when reciting such verses. This humbleness in the essence of worship, which defines the relationship between servant and master. Verses that speak of resurrection and judgment, for example, have a powerful aura of divine majesty. Okay, so now think about this. If it's the plural of majesty, you would expect the Quran to use the plural when it's speaking in some sense of Allah's majesty, and as seen in its connection with things like judgment or resurrection. That's what Karamali is saying. Okay, here's another statement. Okay, this is a statement from Muzamil Siddiqui. And I remember Muzamil Siddiqui from many years ago. He debated a favorite theologian of mine, Dr. Greg Bahnsen at Orange Coast College, along with a Jewish guy named Rabbi Landis. It was a great debate. People should go listen to. I don't think it's on YouTube, though. But in any case, Muzamil Siddiqui, this is what he says. This is a style of speech. Sometimes the speaker says I, and sometimes we. We also use that in our conversations. In the Qur'an, you will see that often the first person singular, such as I or my, is used when Allah speaks about his love, his care, and closeness and forgiveness for his servants. In a similar way, the first person plural is often used when Allah speaks about his power, majesty, glory, great deeds, or when he speaks about his anger and wrath for the sinners and criminals. Okay, so here you have another Muslim saying, I, now he introduces the usage of I. It refers to Allah's closeness, his nearness, his forgiveness, and we represents his anger, his wrath, his fury, his majesty, right? So this reminds me of an old nursery rhyme. I don't know if you heard this growing up, Al, but some of your listeners probably have, where it says that, little girls are made of sugar and spice and all that's nice, and little boys are made of snips and snails and puppy dog tails. Right. Well, so according to these scholars, when Allah uses I, it refers to these beautiful things like his love, his care, his forgiveness, all these sweet sounding things. But when it's talking about Allah's transcendence, his wrath, his anger, his fury, his judgment, it uses language like we. Okay. So this allows us to test the theory. Okay. Remember, Allah doesn't explain it in the Quran. Muhammad doesn't explain it in the Hadith. It's not a part of Arabic language at the time. So we have to look at Quranic usage. Does the Quran use these terms in this way? I for his immanence, his nearness, his closeness, his care, his love, and we for his majesty, anger, wrath, and all of that. Well, it might on a handful of occasions, but I can show you dozens and dozens and dozens of times where it does precisely the opposite. In fact, I can show times where it uses I and we in the same context to talk about Allah's wrath, and I and we in the same context to talk about things like his love, his care, and his forgiveness. But let me just give you, and I also could have quoted Yusuf Ali here, by the way. He also has a statement to that effect. But okay, let me give you some.
Go ahead.
Huh?
Yeah, go ahead. If you want to quote him also.
Okay. So according to this explanation, one would expect to find plural pronouns used when Allah's transcendence, majesty, power, glory, great deeds, anger, and wrath are in view. And while there certainly are such passages, there are a great many of others that do the opposite. Give you an example. This is Surah 2, 126, where Allah says, "For while I will grant them their pleasure," talking about a certain group of people, it says, "but soon will I drive them to the torment of fire, an evil destination." Right? Allah says, "I will drive them to the torment of fire." Does that sound like Allah's love, his care, his forgiveness? Why is he speaking in the singular? Isn't he supposed to be speaking in the plural?
It's kind of, I'm glad you're bringing these examples and bring others, because it shows I feel sympathetic to those who want to run to the rescue, obviously. That they want to come up with something that at least might be appeasing to the hearers, especially from the Muslim community. And it's an example of how our Muslim friends don't take the time to go and spot check what this person have mentioned. In our community, in Christianity, the Lord says, search the books. If you come to me, Anthony, right now and tell me this, you know what? I'll go and double check. Are you telling me really the truth or pulling my leg, basically? So keep going, bro.
Yeah, and think of how often, sometimes Muslims will claim, like if we read a verse of the Quran and we say it obviously means something, like a verse where the Quran seems to clearly say that the Bible is the word of God, it's been preserved, it was intact, in the possession of Muhammad's contemporaries, between their hands, all that sort of thing. The Quran clearly says that. Muslims will say, well, we've got to go to the scholars, right? And or they'll say, where's your proof that that's how this was interpreted? Okay, well, we could equally ask the same question here. They've just bought, in fact, when we do bring the proof, what do they say? Oh, they say that's a weak hadith, right? Well, I'd like a Muslim to bring me even a weak hadith explaining Allah's use of plural pronouns. Bring me a weak hadith. I'd like to see it, right? Even a weak one. But they can't do that, right? But this ties in with your point, because they've just accepted this. They've just accepted that this is a plural of majesty without any basis. Their scholars have not demonstrated this to them, right? And we know that. We know that because, again, their scholars say, if you look at their actual scholars like M.A.S. Abdel Halim, it wasn't a feature of Arabic at the time of Muhammad, right? He claims it was introduced in the Qur'an, but where's the proof of that, right? Where is the proof that it's introduced? I've just shown an example of scores of examples. In fact, I'll give a couple of others just so people see that I'm not just, out on a limb and maybe found a stray verse. Maybe one of Allah's verses got away, but the rest of them are consistent. Here's Surah 356. As to those who reject faith, I will punish them. I will punish them with terrible agony in this world and the hereafter. I thought I is the word for closeness, forgiveness, tenderness, care, right? That's not what we see here. That's Surah 3, verse 56. Here's Surah 5, verse 115. I will punish them with a penalty such as I have not inflicted on anyone among all the peoples, right? Surah 7:18, hell will I fill with you all. I hope everybody's starting to see this. There's a pattern here. Allah likes to speak in the singular when he's referring to things like his wrath, his anger, his fury, the very opposite of what the plural of majesty theory suggests, right? Now, I can actually do the same thing with the use of the plural we. I can show the word we being used to state things about Allah's forgiveness or his mercy or his care or his closeness. For example, here's Surah 2, verse 23. This is the book. In it is guidance sure, without doubt, to those who fear Allah, who believe in the unseen, are steadfast in prayer, and spend out of what we have provided for them. Okay? So here's Allah. Clearly, this is something bespeaking his closeness, his nearness, his care, right? This is what he provided for them, but he says we provided it. Why isn't it in the singular? Why is it the opposite of what the theory suggests should be the case?
Right. Let me interject one quick thing here about how Allah sometimes even talk about himself as if he is one of many others, and he's not really, basically saying there is no others. No, he's saying I'm comparing myself to others. Now, I'm looking at it from Quranic standpoint. I mean, they're the one who's saying he's the only one. Look what he says, for instance, in chapter 37, verse 125. I want to thank BMW 635. I didn't know, by the way, BMW have 635 model, but maybe. So BMW 635 mentioned that, and I appreciate that reminder, of course. In chapter 37, verse 125, Allah says, do you call upon Baal, basically, and leave the best of creators? So in other words, I mean, as if he's saying Baal is a creator, but I'm the best of these creators. I mean, the argument is laughable, actually.
Yeah, so that's actually a whole other topic that'd be interesting at some point, because the Quran says that Allah refers to Allah as witnesses, as heirs in the plural, reckoners, knowers, inheritors, responders, possessors, planners, senders, expanders, creators. I have a whole list of all these plural terms that Allah uses for himself. But yeah, like you said, best of creators. How many creators are there, Allah? Right? So yeah, so we have an inconsistency here. The Quran does not establish any kind of pattern of usage that would justify saying this is a plural of majesty. It wasn't a feature of the language. It isn't something that Allah explained in the Quran or Muhammad explained in the Hadith, and it isn't even something that can be established by any kind of consistent usage of the Quran. Again, if people want to see just how many passages break the mold, just go get my articles, right? Al has read this, so he can testify. The examples I'm giving you are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Okay, there's plenty more where that comes from. So don't take my, one or two examples as the only examples I can give. Let me give one more here to show that.
Yeah. So give me 1 second, brother. Folks, here is the first part of Anthony's article. The minute you click on it and you read it, and you're gonna fall asleep at the end of the day. I can assure you guys, this is a perfect example of how Anthony did a job I don't think anyone would have wanted to do. Read that, and then it will prompt you to part 2 and part 3 and so on and so forth.
Yeah, what Al's pointing out is the article is a bit tedious, and it's tedious just because, I thought nobody's ever done this, right? Nobody. I just hear the claim all the time, but I don't know anybody that's ever actually looked at this, and I wanted to make sure that I had covered all the bases and nobody could claim that I had overlooked things. I just wanted all the information there. I didn't really think of it as the sort of thing somebody would include on their list of things to read for pleasure. It was more, this is something to become familiar with and then use at your leisure or how you will, right?
And brother, I want to give you a kudos for this, Lord bless you, because this is a question always Christians ask me. I mean, whenever I'm teaching, why does Allah use the we? And I always give them these 2 quick answers. It's either these are some of the examples, explanations you receive, or if you want to know the deeper one, go to Anthony Rogers, series on it, and then you'll enjoy the depth of that. Brother, are you planning even an update in it? Because since you wrote it, I mean, I know there's a lot of wonderful data that you're bringing into this. Maybe you can do part, another part. Maybe you want to do an edit to it, or maybe a whole new series, because this is very powerful, by the way. Powerful for both sides, for Christians to understand and for Muslims to see for themselves what's going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is, so back in the day, I'll leave names aside, but as you know, Answering Islam was a more active website. I love the website. I think anybody who doesn't go to Answering Islam is squandering a valuable resource. It's still, in my mind, although there's so much out there, it's still, in my mind, one of the best single resources on Islam. If you're just talking about a one-stop shop, it's Answering Islam all day, right, as far as written material. You have stuff on there from classical writers, right, Christians from the past. I heard somebody on your show the other day, I think, that was trying to come up with the name of a Muslim who was a famous, a Christian who was a famous missionary to Muslims. And I knew he was talking about Raymond Lull, but he couldn't think of the name. But anyways, it has Raymond Lull on there. It has Samuel Zwemer on there.
That's right.
It's got all kinds of Al-Kindi, just all these great resources of Christians from the past. It also has so many incredible things from Christians up to the present time. Stuff from you, stuff from David, stuff from Sam, stuff from so many others, Callum Beck, Samuel Green, just so many of us that have been writing for the website over the years, that, everybody should go see it. But
well, here's the thing, brother. I promise you, I am going to start a blog, and I want you, you write anything, I will personally publish it for you. But we still want to be praying for the brother, in Answering Islam to keep up with what's going on, obviously, as you know. So
just to finish that thought, was just that the administrator of the site, some things came along, and he's become busy, right? And that has just meant that the publishing became very slow, and it. For me, it just became, I just started focusing elsewhere to get things out, and YouTube became such a useful tool that, I just spend so much time doing that. But I do love writing, so I could easily be prodded back in that direction. And of course, a lot of times when I talk, I'm using articles that I've written in the past as my, Sam does the same thing. He goes to his articles where he has things listed. Of course.
Yeah, I think Sam writes when he's asleep, actually. During sleep time, he writes his articles.
Yeah. And of course, he's got a file cabinet in his head, but, but he still will pull things up on his own articles because it's there in a very, it's all there handy for him. So I do like writing things because it puts it in one place. But we'll see. One of these days, maybe I'll revamp that. I will say this: if somebody wants to read a shorter article where I'm actually looking primarily at the use of this in the Old Testament, I have an article called, I think it's called The Plural of Majesty. Allah is neither plural nor majestic. I think that's the name of the article. And that's about 10 pages. But I'm primarily focused there on the Old Testament usage. There, I'm pointing out that there's no such thing as a plural of majesty in Hebrew when it comes to verbs. And that's just a fact, right? I mean, it's stated by one Hebrew grammarian after another. I mean, you could look at Emil Rodiger, who updated Gesenius's famous Hebrew lexicon. You could look at Taylor Lewis, a classical and biblical scholar. One scholar after another points out there's no such thing as a plural of majesty in Hebrew when it comes to verbs. So, and the verb in let us make is a verb in Hebrew, right? We think of it as a pronoun in English because us is a separate word, but it's built into the Hebrew verb in Hebrew. So, yeah.
Very good. So, brother, I want to leave us here with a teaser for people because this is a deep topic. Obviously, I want you to finish if you still have something left for this particular part. But then what would be the next part, that you like to systematically get into?
Okay, so there are a couple of other interpretations. These can be dealt with. We've dealt with really the other ones in quick order. We could easily expand on our comments on any of them, but the other two that I would also bring up, and again, these aren't as common, but one interpretation says that Allah is referring to his names and attributes, right? Allah has many names and attributes. So when he says we, that's what he's referring to, himself together with his names and attributes, okay? I'm chuckling a bit because, again, it's problems galore when you do that sort of thing. They're fishing so desperately for an explanation that they only open up more cans of worms. But that's one explanation. Then there's what I would call the Mu'tazili interpretation, which you find in people like Muhammad Asad. In Muhammad Asad's commentary on the Qur'an, he talks about how the reason Allah banters back and forth between singular and plural, first person and third person, is because Allah's trying to show that he doesn't fit the ordinary conventions of what a person is, right? So really, he's not a person at all, according to Muhammad Asad. And so that's how he explains it, because even the concept of personhood, in some sense, presupposes some kind of distinction, right? And we can talk about that next time. That's kind of a philosophical idea, but the Mu'tazili were philosophically inclined, and so that's where this gets its genesis. So those are the next two interpretations, and then what we would talk about after that is finally when somebody calls Muhammad's bluff, right? The famous Christians of Najran who come and put Muhammad on the spot, who are Arabic-speaking Christians, right? Arabic-speaking Christians. They know their language. They're going to come and ask Muhammad, what's this all about? If God's not a Trinity, why is he talking like this, right? And then we're going to see how Muhammad answers. How does Muhammad get out of a tight spot?
Of course, chapter 3 is telling how he answered.
It's not pretty. It's not pretty.
Well, brother, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. What is your YouTube channel? I think they're listing some of okay, so your YouTube channel is being listed here. Everyone look at our moderator, Mariana, listed that. Anthony Rogers' YouTube channel is there, and I'll make sure that I'll take it and put it in the description also so that you guys can go there. And brother, if you have a mean for people to gift, financially to you, please provide that to me to put it in my description as well of your channel. And here comes the pause.
Oh, yeah. So I thought you were still talking to the viewers, and I was reading.
Now for you, if you have a mean for people to support you, mention that. Is it Patreon, PayPal, and also provide me, those links so we can make sure that people know about them.
Okay. Yeah, I was just looking at the comments here. So very cool. Yeah, next time will be an exciting episode, folks. Again, you're not going to want to miss it, because actually, I will say this, just again, to sort of encourage people to watch it. What we're going to look at finally get to how Muhammad tries to deal with this, actually creates huge problems, not just for this issue, but for a whole host of issues when it comes to Islam. Right? This opens up a real problem area for Islam, and it really permeates the whole religion. So yeah. I wish people would make use of this. So hopefully I can get this out there more, on our broadcast.
Absolutely. And you and I will decide about the next time. And there'll be part 2, folks, and hopefully even part 3. And I ask Anthony if he would consider to be a regular here, so that as long as his schedule permits. Of course, everyone, thank you so much as always. And here is just a quick snapshot of next week, at least what I know. We're going to finish with Brother Alex Blagojevich, at least the series that we've been doing. And I know Anthony's shaking his head. That's okay. Close your ears. And then we have also the textual criticism with Brother James E. Snap Jr. We are continuing part 2 and part 3. Next time we're going to talk about this coming week. We'll be talking about the ending of Mark. And then the week after, we'll talk about the passage about the adulterous woman in John chapter end of 7 and also part of chapter 8. And we will have an amazing testimony of someone who left Christianity, accepted Islam, left Islam, came back to truly following the Lord. And it's almost you get 2 for 1, because his journey back brought another person as well. And we'll leave it that way. I'll be announcing those. So Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. Saturday will be the testimony, and I will be making these announcements and giving you guys the schedule for them. Brother, thank you so much as always. We're blessed to have you, and may the Lord, of course, continue to use you in a mighty way. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the moderators. Thank you for those who gave through Snapchat, and I appreciate you. God bless. This is Al Fadi, over and out.